We're excited today to be interviewing Garth Schuer, and Garth has an interesting perspective. I love this. Garth, everyone I've done for these interviews so far has typically been a personality or a director or a producer, but I think you're going to have a different type of view because you were the station photographer at TVOntario. So we're excited to talk to you today, and I got a few questions here for you as we get started. First of all, tell us a little bit about your background, Garth, and where you grew up and how you got involved in photography.
Well, it was a roundabout route. I was born in New York City, in Queens, and grew up along the Hudson Valley, ultimately in a city called Poughkeepsie. And then went off to college in Pennsylvania, and I attended law school in Washington, D.C. Spent 3 years in law school. So how do I get from law to photography? I came to Canada in very late in 1969, and for various reasons I didn't practice law. So and I was self-taught in photography. I was always keen on it, and because I'm a visual artist, it came relatively easily. I do fine art now, but since then I was a commercial photographer. So I came to Toronto, started a photo studio downtown, doing. It was a block away from a new station, City TV. So I walked in there, said, "Do you need a photographer?" They weren't even on the air yet, and so I became their photographer, freelance. And then I did a lot of work for the CBC, CTV, and freelance for TVO before I joined the staff there. So from 1970 to 1980, I had a commercial photo studio doing television, live theater, fashion, and magazines.
It's very interesting. I didn't know that you've been involved in City TV in the early days. Can you give me an idea? I know City TV started in the early 1970s. What was it like? Did you ever have the opportunity to brush shoulders with Moses Znaimer or any of those early personalities?
Moses probably every day. I did a number of portraits of him. Yeah, he was tremendously energetic, starting a new TV station in the city. It was, the first while was low budget. I mean, we did things. I did TV commercials on stills. Went to restaurants. Restaurants would advertise on City. So I would go and do still photographs in a restaurant, photograph the location, some dishes, the chef, and then they would use 6 or 8 of the still photos with a voiceover, and that was a commercial.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I remember reading just how advantageous the station was. Many people didn't believe that it would succeed in the early days, and yet it's become, one of the hallmarks of Toronto entertainment today. City TV, everyone knows what that is.
There's a lot of skepticism about whether it would succeed, and it did. I mean, Brian Lanahan, who did movie interviews of movie celebrities, was very popular, and it really took off. I mean, now it's it's a very established TV station.
And you mentioned also the CBC. Were you doing freelance photography for them as well?
Yeah, I was doing both for the French side and English side. Photographs of the hosts, on-air hosts, that they would use either for in advertising, posters, annual reports. I'd go down, and when it was usually in just before the new season started. They would do like around July, August, September, when they were coming up to a new season. I get a lot of work, and then not so much again, because they just didn't need a lot throughout the year. They also had a staff photographer, but if things I suppose that they couldn't handle, I I got freelance work from. And City TV, CTV. I did a lot for CTV. Same thing, photographs of on-air hosts for the sides of buses and billboards and however they were advertising.
Now, were you doing photography work for TV Ontario concurrently, freelance in the late '70s, or did you not get involved until the '80s with TVO?
Yeah, there was I and another photographer who we were friends. We had an agent, and he would get us bookings. And one of the steady clients was TV Ontario. They didn't have a staff photographer. I don't think they had a staff photographer until they hired me in 1980. So they freelanced for those first 10 or more years. So he would alternate. I would get a job, then this other photographer would get a job, and we, go back and forth, doing stuff for, Saturday Night at the Movies and various shows. So from about the mid '70s, I started working for TVO. Actually, I met my wife there. Well, I shouldn't say that. We met. She happened to be working there, and we met separately, but she was also working there. So we, for about a couple of years, we were both working for TVO.
What work was she doing there?
She was an assistant producer to a woman named Gladys Richards. My wife was had a long career in advertising. Came from Britain and worked for a whole bunch of advertising agencies in New York City, and then transferred to Toronto, and we met here in about 1976.
And what was your wife's name when she was working for TVO?
Sanders, Victoria Sanders.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, bring us back to the time when you were officially hired by TV Ontario to be their station photographer. Who was it that hired you? How did that come about? Tell us the story.
Yeah, the director of graphic design, Dick Dearhodge. In 1980, there was a really bad recession here, I think in the United States as well. And work just dried up. And we have 5 children. We had 5, at that time, 5 small children. And the freelance work really just went south. I mean, it was a really bad recession. So I started looking around for a job, and somebody I knew casually mentioned, I think it was even a waitress at some restaurant, said, well, you should go into TVO. They're looking for a photographer. And I didn't know. At first it didn't register. And she mentioned it again. And I don't know what her connection was. And I didn't know this person very well. But anyway, I said, well, sure, why not? So I went in, applied. I had an interview. And there was a bunch of people applying because there was a lot of freelancers looking for work at that time. Something like 16 or 20 people. And so I had an interview. About a month later, I followed it up, and I got the job. And it was part of the graphic. I was in the graphic design department, which at that time was about 8 people.
So people like Joyce Crosby and Dick Dearhodge.
That's right. Dick was the head designer. Joyce Crosby and so there was so many people. There were a lot of people came and went.
Was it Dick that hired you?
Yes. Yeah. Directly. Yeah. John Randall was another name. He left many years before I left. He moved to Florida. He and I were very close friends. But Dick worked directly for Dick Dearhodge, and then they sort of branched out, and I got transferred to the communications department, which in a way made a little bit more sense, because even though the end user was the design department, the initial internal clients were the communications people. They were the ones who actually wanted the photography done.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, it made sense to be in that department, working with the publicists. So I got transferred out of design into communications. I mean, it was like one floor difference. It was going from the 6th floor to the 5th or something.
It's interesting that you mentioned Dick Durhodge. He's been so kind and gracious in helping me with some of my research, and one of the things that he provided me with is the original storyboard a picture of the original storyboard animation for Polka Dot Door from 1971.
Wow.
So his son actually has it now there in Toronto. His son Zachary is involved in film, just
Dick
like his
was
dad.
there from the very beginning. It was called OECA at the time. But,
That's right.
Then now everybody calls it TVOntario. So I worked directly for Dick for probably the first 10 years, and then I got transferred just to another department, which was just a matter of reporting to somebody different, basically.
Well, I know you had the opportunity to work with a lot of different personalities at TVO, and I was curious to know, out of everyone that you, either in a photography role or even in a co-worker role, who was it there at TVO that you worked with or took pictures of that really made an impact on you, and how did they do that?
Well, I'd have to start with Elwy Yost, because with Saturday Night at the Movies was like the big, franchise show. Everybody watched it, and because it was like, and Elwy became a celebrity because of it. And Elwy was just very knowledgeable about film, and it was just a pleasure to work with. He had a great sense of humor. He was easygoing. And I got to know him, as well as anybody. I mean, photograph him or a guest. He'd have these guests. He'd do these interviews as background information for the film. I mean, he'd be showing Citizen Kane, and he may, interview somebody who was involved with Citizen Kane. Not Orson Welles, but somebody, right? So there was a lot of people coming through there, when I joined TVO, even though there was a recession on, it was about the height of TVO's size and budget, and they were hiring then. I mean, in 1980, I might be slightly incorrect, but there was like 800 to 1,000 people either on staff or on contract at TVO, and they had for a small station, had a significant budget. And then, for various reasons, for political reasons, some of the subsequent governments started cutting back on TVO and downsizing. It went, they kept downsizing and then upsizing and downsizing. But when I joined, it was a big production. One of the probably the largest educational broadcaster in the world.
Well, I know that they won a tremendous amount of awards in the 1970s and 80s for their work, and it was noted all around the world. Other things people have told me as I've interviewed them is that TVOntario was really experimental and the cutting edge when it came to children's programming. It was a very creative time in the 70s and the 80s. How would you describe the atmosphere of TVO and the family of people that you worked with in the 80s?
Really professional. All the producers I worked with, many of them came from educational backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't necessarily come out of commercial television. They were teachers who then went in, who were hired or by TVO to produce educational television, largely for children, but teenagers and adults as well. So they were very knowledgeable about the educational system. I mean, TVO had a mandate, right, to provide, a curriculum-based, in addition to entertainment, curriculum-based supporting the Ontario curriculum, with television content that could be used in classrooms and supporting the current curriculum. So there was, and at that time, like I said, there were whole departments just doing research and publications. There was a whole publications department producing educational in-class material to be used while the teacher was viewing the programming with the children. Right? They would actually turn on a TV set in the classroom and watch whatever it was they were watching, right? And there'd be support material along with that.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. I remember I've talked at length with Clive Vanderberg, who created today's special, and Clive told me that the pilot episodes for today's special were shown to kindergarten children, and Clive and other educational supervisors would be in the room, and they would actually chart out when the students would be engaged so that they could understand, like, there was a whole science behind how these shows were put together. It was very fascinating.
The research, before, like with today's special, Polka Dot Door, TVO Kids, tremendous amount of research went into it beforehand. Consulting with the Ministry of Education.
Right.
I mean, and the ministry, I would assume, would say, well, look, we need such and such type programming in education, and not just smaller children, but right up through high school, and I suppose beyond.
Wow. So, how many years were you at TVOntario total as their station photographer?
1980 to 2004.
So it hasn't been all that recent. Just 9 years ago is when you retired.
Well, yeah, a little less, because I retired, and then there was nobody to do the photography, so I was hired back on contract for 2 years. So I officially retired in 2004 because they were downsizing again, and I qualified for an earlier retirement than normal, but they then still needed a photographer, so I came back as a freelancer. But they downsized. There was a lot less photography. At that point, for various reasons, because TVO eliminated certain programming, so the actual quantity of photography was greatly reduced, so they could actually rely on a freelancer rather than a full-time staff.
Now, I know even when you love your job, there's always one or two tasks that you're like, I would really not like to do this today. And then there's those other ones that, just the fact that you get to do that puts a smile on your face even if you're having a lousy day. What were some of the most memorable shows that you took photographs for? What were some of the people or the shows or the personalities or the projects that even if you were having a lousy day, it just brightened you up because it was so exciting, it was enjoyable to do?
There was a series of shows, but there was a show, or a series, I should say, called Good Works, and these were short episodes. I think they were 15 minutes after editing, introducing high school students to potential job types of jobs. So we would go out and do with a whole crew, and they would do it. They would show what it took to be an apprentice at doing carpentry or electrical work, or working on a ship, or in a gold mine, or in a nuclear power plant. And there were we made dozens and dozens of these shows all over, mostly in southern Ontario, but throughout the province. The reason, and in operating rooms, it was the reason that was so interesting is because these are places I'd never normally get into and meet these people. So we were actually in a nuclear power station, inside of it, right? We were on like a super tanker. We were on up the CN Tower, down a gold mine, over 5,000 feet down the shaft of a gold mine up in, I think it was either Timmins or Sudbury. I forget which city, but anyway, and on. It was, so, because the normal thing would be go into a studio and become part of the crew. You'd be there maybe all day, maybe just for a few hours, and I would take photographs, and it was interesting. But that show, Good Works, was fascinating because I got to see and meet people and into situations I probably wouldn't, never been in before, and they were very successful. They were used to introduce, someone who's looking to become a nurse, or would see this, and then they would explain, well, you want to become a nurse, you got to take these courses, you got to do this, you got to do that, and this is this is what you're going to expect if you're going to be a nurse or an electrician. So that's one. It's funny. It sticks in my mind. Plus, I get to travel a bit too.
It sounds like your camera was like a passport, and it afforded you some opportunities you wouldn't have already.
Yeah, no, because they'd fly me up. I mean, the crew was already up there. Let's say in a place, so I'd get on this small commuter plane, fly up for the day or so, and do some photography and fly back. So it was exciting. It was a lot of fun working on that show. And the other shows. Well, the agenda was interesting because there were so many interesting guests on, that mostly politicians, of course, but so you get to meet the premiers of Ontario and federal ministers and Alan Gregg's show. He did a wide-ranging. That was later on, it was in the 90s. He interviewed. He did interviews of all kinds of people. I mean, from people making movies to authors, and the people he interviewed were really people that like Germaine Greer and Salman Rushdie and Mordecai Richler and Conrad Black, Richard Branson. So they were just fun. I mean, I had always done a lot of celebrity photography as a freelancer, but it was more of it. I mean, meeting billionaires and people like that.
Very interesting. Any kid shows that TVO did that stand out in your mind that you enjoyed doing photography for?
Well, Polka Dot Door, but today's special perhaps more so, because we went on. They did a lot of on today's special. We did a lot of. They'd have a guest in like Karen Kane or Oscar Peterson. Doing something with one of the hosts, and we a lot of the filming was done in a store that no longer exists called Simpson's, which was a big department store. So we'd go in there like after they closed, which was 10 o'clock at night, and work till maybe 5 in the morning. It was a bit much, but today's special was really interesting to work on. And on the French side, there was a show called Volt, VOLT, which there was a certain, and there was a the French and English sides were combined in the same building and under the same sort of jurisdiction until recently, and then they kind of now operate separately. But the people in Volt, young actors, they were just fun. They just had a lot of fun. It was a different culture. The French side and the English side, you really saw the difference between French and English Canadians in terms of style and content. And I'm not comparing them. It's just they were different. And the folks from Volt were. Sorry, let me hang that up. They were just fun. I don't know how else to describe it. Their energy is fun to be with, And
That's
we
great.
did a lot of. Again, they went out on location all the time, and all over the province too.
Well, I made a list of a handful of personalities that were involved at TVOntario, and I wondered if you could comment a little bit if you had any interaction with them. Some have passed on, others are still with us. Ted Coneybear, who worked with Polka Dot Door for a while. Did you have any interaction with Ted, and what was he like?
Yeah, I did with Polka Dot Door. I didn't show up at every episode, but if they had a guest on or they had a special, I did. I can't count how many. I mean, over the years, many shows. Ted was he was a pleasure to work with. Really nice, pleasant man, easygoing, gave good direction, had a nice sense of humor, and he just made you feel part of, like a family, part of the team. Even when I saw him back in the station with TVO shot it on location in a studio, because they could leave the setup. It was inside TVO. The studios were quite small and they couldn't accommodate a big set, so they rented studio space in various commercial settings around the city. So Ted, I got to know Ted quite well. He's just a pleasure to work with, an easygoing, man.
Did you have any interaction with Jed Mackay when he took over production duties?
Yeah, same thing. Jed was different styles, different personalities, but again, Jed was he made you feel, part of the show. The thing about a production with the still photographer doesn't always get first priority. Because of the nature of making television, there's always pressure. Okay, let's put it right. You're meeting a deadline, and so to take out even 10 minutes or half an hour or an hour to stop and do still photography was on top of everything else. So the best producers like Ted and Jed were aware that they needed and wanted the still photography, and made it a priority to let me, do my work. I worked on outside of TVO before I was with TVO. If you're working on a film shoot or something, sometimes you have to be a little pushy with the director to say, we need photographs here, and director is already like a day behind in shooting or something, and yeah, okay, we need these still photographs. So you gotta. It's a bit more. With really good producers and directors, they realized that once the production stops, they got to advertise it. They got to sell the show, and virtually all the time they need still photographs for posters and advertising. So they're thinking. They're the best producers and directors are thinking ahead, not just the stressful day they're having, but like, when this thing is done and we're going to try to sell it, right? We need a photograph to send to Cannes or Venice or someplace to say, here's a poster of our show, and buy it.
Did you ever have any interaction with Ruth Vernon or Jennifer Harvey?
Oh yeah, both. Ruth. Indirectly. A bit more with Jennifer, because she was doing, she was researching and doing production stuff that I would come into more contact with Jennifer, and because my wife is British, and Jennifer was originally from England, as I recall. We would always, I don't know, I would mention, we'd just been to England, and she said, oh yeah, I have relatives, like 5 miles from where you were staying and stuff. Ruth was, I came into contact with Ruth, but more on an administrative level. I mean, I would, she might need something done. But both were just really nice.
Speaking of British, and this might be a stretch, but you remember back in the 70s and 80s, TVOntario aired Doctor Who from the BBC. And to meet the educational requirements mandated by the province, they used to have to sandwich the episodes with something educational on the end. And they got the science fiction author Judith Merrill to do that. And did you ever have any interaction with Judith?
No, I'm trying to think. I've heard the name, but I didn't have any interaction.
It might have been just before your time. And then, of course, the last person I wanted to ask about was, did you ever have any interaction with Heather Conkey?
Oh, Heather, yeah. Heather, I photographed. I mean, she had her own show, and I worked with her. I photographed her. I mean, I can't even remember how many times. Sometimes we used her own house as a location, and she was one of the most talented people. Aside from just being on air, she wrote and directed and did music, and she is a multi-talented, person. Yeah, and a really nice person too. Yeah, I worked with Heather. Not with, but photographed her dozens of times.
Now, I remember in the 80s and maybe the late 70s, but certainly in the 80s, TVOntario, for their station ID cards, had some beautiful photography done. Some of it looked as almost it was paintings, but sometimes it would be like a skier in mid-shot going down a slope of snow. Other times, sometimes it was animated, it was computer generated, it might be a typewriter, but they were all often used for the station IDs. Can you help us understand where those came from and if you had any responsibility for those?
Yeah, I wouldn't have done the animation or any of the video, but I did create stills that were used as either station IDs or program IDs, and so I would work with Dick Deerhodge, and I would use I think the typewriter one is one that I remember. If it was a children's program, you might have some little toy dinosaurs coming out of a book, as if they were walking out of the book. We did. I did dozens and dozens of those, and those were, and I sort of did those in a sense on my own, but with direction. They would give me an idea, but I'd create something from some of either the props or just an idea from the show itself. And we did, and they were, we had to turn them around because it was always just, it seemed like the deadlines were always short. I mean, it wasn't like, you had weeks to do this. You had several days. So
and I remember there being
this is all still photography. This is all before digital.
And I remember there being countless IDs of station IDs of these photographs. Like, you could turn the channel on any day of the week and there'd be something different that you'd see. There seemed to be a lot of variation. How would those be prepared and for them to be filmed to be station IDs? Can you kind of give us a walkthrough of what all is required in that? That's what the graphic design department would do. They would literally create a piece of artwork, a flat piece of artwork, right? Either, and there were freelancers who did this as well. But they would create a flat piece of artwork, either from a painting or from using graphic techniques. And this is before computers again. Mm-hmm. And then there'd be maybe a layer of film over it with the logos on it. And I would then, it would be given to me, and it'd be every week. I'd say in those days I probably devoted at least half a day per week photographing them, getting them to the lab quickly, getting them back, cutting them up, and then mounting them in little slide mounts, right? And then rushing them over to the what was called the telecine chain, which is literally a round box that these slides are put in, right? And so we had a Leica copy stand, and I would put the artwork in a box under glass. We had a Leica camera, photographed it, and there was a grid on there called Safe Title, which is what would actually go out on air, what would actually be seen in someone's house. Right? The Safe Title meant there would be no cutoff outside of that, so they would actually see that. And then and the graphic design people would be, turning these out. I mean, they each were assigned one or two to work on. That was a major. There were, and, like I was saying, it probably took a better part of a day, a week, every week just to do that, and then it all changed completely. It went digital. Now, what became of those beautiful slides? What was the fate of those?
They should all still exist. I would make one or two copies for the on-air department, and then I would always make a couple of backups just in case something went wrong, and I would put the backup copy in slide holders and put them in the archives, either under the title of the show or perhaps just altogether. I might have created a separate file called Station IDs, and there were a lot of them. I mean, over 20 years. I mean, there were hundreds.
Oh yeah. And many people, like I said, including myself, remember there being just variation upon variation. Yeah. Now, were any of your photographs used in any of the curriculum materials that derived from some of the children's shows?
Yeah, a lot of it. Trying to remember, there was a whole department called publications, mm-hmm. And there were a bunch of people. I mean, I don't remember how many. I mean, certainly 8, 10, 12 or more people actually putting together these curriculum-based support material. Mm-hmm. And those were all illustrated with still photographs. Mm-hmm. Either just to stills I took out of the show, or in some cases actually illustrating. And sometimes we actually did, if it had to illustrate a teaching technique or showing children a process of doing something step by step,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I can't remember the subjects, but how to build a diorama, or how to follow a math problem.
Mm-hmm.
We might actually go into a classroom and photograph the teachers actually demonstrating the process of how they would teach this. But that was a big department, and see, there was so much going on in those early days.
Mm-hmm.
Well, early days. There was mid days in the 1980s. I was really busy. In fact, I probably could just about keep up with the demands of all the still photography, running between either the network, the actual productions, or the publication department. Those three departments consumed a lot of photography, and the publicists, the communications people. They would a new show would be coming on, and the publicist would then, of course, try to get publicity at one of the local newspapers, the Toronto Star or the Sun or somebody. So they would need photographs to say, here's our upcoming season, here's a photograph, and they would try to get the Star to review it favorably, obviously.
That was my next question: were any of your photographs used in newspapers? And you answered it right there, so that's great.
Oh yeah, many times. Usually I didn't get a credit, but that's the way it is. They often just credit their own staff photographers. They credit TVO, photograph courtesy of TVO, which is the way it should be. But they were used in fact on the cover of the three or four daily newspapers published a weekly equivalent to TV guide that came, I think, on Saturdays or something, right? And on the cover of those guides, if TVO would get a cover, there'd be a lot of competition for it.
Mm-hmm.
But L.W. Yost or one of the hosts would appear on those covers, and those photographs I did.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, I know the publication you're talking about in the Toronto Star. It's called Star Week.
That's right, Star Week.
And I know that there's a famous cover with the Pokeroo on it that you probably took.
Yeah, Pokeroo, L.W. Yost, and a lot of others. Those we provided them with those photographs.
We were chatting about names and personalities before at TVO, and I also know, in addition to people that you worked with, you also worked under a lot of different CEOs and chairs during your time there. And I thought I'd rattle off a few names. Maybe you could comment if you remember anything about interacting with these people or what they were like. Some, again, have left us, and others are still with us. Jim Parr, John Radford, Bernard Ostry. Do any of those names ring a bell?
I worked. I was employed when Jim Parr. Well, when I came in 1980, Jim Parr would have been the chair and CEO. Mr. Radcliffe tragically only was there for a short while, and he died. I can't remember now if it was in an accident. He was only there for months, and he tragically died. Bernard Ostry. Each one had a different personality and mandate, largely because they were political appointees. So the government of the day had a certain agenda, right? If it was the conservative, NDP, or liberal, and the person they appointed would be there to be independent, but they were aware of being political appointees, and there'd be a new minister of education, So changes inevitably there were different styles. Um, and
What do you remember about Jim Parr?
he was a real gentleman. I mean, he was a real educator. Um, always, um, he was almost someone like, in a way, what could you compare it to? Like a diplomat who would always take interest in whoever he was talking to. You know, like that's not the right word, but he took, if you were speaking with him, you know, he wouldn't be rushed, you know, to get on to something else. He would be really interested in who you were, what you were doing. He'd ask you questions about your job,
Mm-hmm.
and I think he was famous for wearing a bow tie. Pretty sure he wore a bow tie, which is. You know.
What about Bernard Ostry?
Bernard was a bit more reserved. He he was not. He was more. Um, he was more. Um, he wasn't as hands on in terms of walking around the TVO like some of the CEOs would they literally walk around talking to people. Mr. Austri was more to do with administration I didn't say he kept to himself. That's not true, but he didn't, you know, wasn't quite as outgoing in terms of walking around and interacting with people. He interacted more with the upper management people.
Now, I know this next name brought along a lot of change. What do you remember about Peter Herndorf?
Um, Peter was great. Yeah, he brought a lot of change. Um, he really turned. I mean, from the beginning of his um, mandate there to the end, TVO was significantly different. But Peter was he was he was the most approachable one. Well, I shouldn't say the most. He was one of the most approachable CEOs that TVO had. I mean, he would go down and uh, you know, chat with the crew, or he'd walk around talking with people. He not giving away any secrets, but he was a heavy smoker, and he'd go out with, you know, you couldn't smoke in TVO, technically, but he would go out in front of the station and hang out with, you know, who's ever out there, the crew members on a break, and have a cigarette. Right? Hopefully he's quit smoking by then. But anyway, back then it was he was pretty obvious he was a smoker, and so you'd always see him out there smoking a cigarette or chatting with someone or talking to crew members. He was and he would walk around. That sounds like a big deal, but you know, for some organizations, the top people, the CEO or the chairperson, don't have much to do with the day-to-day working people, right? They're there as administrators and working with the board of directors. So there was each one had a different style.
What changes did he bring about, and why were they needed?
Well, I think I'd say he emphasized more current affairs. I think that was his background when he was with the CBC. And so current affairs programming became much more dominant. The agenda with Steve Paikin, and I think less emphasis on I guess drama shows or entertainment. I think his emphasis was more, I wouldn't say educational so much as politics and current affairs, and he really boosted that. And that's even today now. You know, the agenda with Steve Paikin is a much watched show. You know, all the politicians and you know, and people are you know, on there for debates about current affairs.
Very good. Very good. Tell me a little bit about. I want to shift gears here and talk about the mysterious TVOntario archive. I know that you would have had. We've talked a little bit about this over email, I know, and I know that you would have had, you know, access to interaction with the archivists. Give me everything you know. What when you were there? What existed? What did it look like? Where was it kept? What kind of organization was it in? What all was being kept?
Well, pretty much everything. The archives, as such, were. I worked with a woman called Nancy Green, and Nancy, I would do the photography, and then Nancy would send out the film I took to a lab, have it processed, have contact sheets made, have talk to the publicists who needed prints made. So while I was off doing more photography, she was actually doing the actual processing of sending to the lab film, getting it back, having prints made, and then cataloging it and putting it in the active files, which became the archives. There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There were 6 or more really large filing cabinets in the communications department, and each show, you know, Today's Special or Saturday Night at the Movies, everything associated with that show would go in there. The 35 millimeter slides, black and white negatives, prints, contact sheets, and sometimes even some of the print material that resulted from it. So there were, from whenever it was started, the earliest days. I mean, there was archival material from certainly the early 70s.
So there was something established even when you came in that they had some kind of archive.
Yeah. Then Nancy, there was a rearrangement of some departments, and I sort of took over that responsibility. She got transferred to another department doing some similar things. But so then I became responsible for virtually all of that, going back and forth to the lab, having prints made. If it was a real rush, like a print needed to be made for the next morning, I would do it myself at home. I have a dark room at home, so I would bring the film home and make a print, because a publicist might need it faster than the lab could do it. But that was not very often, but I would do that occasionally. But then, so I took over the archives, and then when I left, there was some downsizing as well, but all of that archival material, all of those file cabinets with, I mean, I couldn't even, you know, many photographs, right, was taken from the offices of TVO in the communications department and sent over to what was called the warehouse. The warehouse was over on Lansdowne Avenue. And that's where props were there, costumes, whole sets, you know, big stuff that had to be stored, right?
And where was this located again?
Not far from TVO. It was on Lansdowne Avenue and DuPont, which is probably 20 minutes between TVO, which was on Young Street in Eglinton, down there. And it was literally a warehouse. It was a big area in an old industrial building. And just, all the, let's say a set, Saturday night at the movies set or another set which wasn't being used, there was not enough storage room on site at TVO, and it would be taken down, put in the truck, driven over there, and kept till it was needed a month later. And there were like 2 or 3 people working there. All of the photography, this is after I left, so I didn't actually do it, was moved to the warehouse, which I thought I didn't particularly think was a good idea, because it was off-site, and it was, when you needed something from these archives, it was always on short notice. Right? A publicist would say, I got a deadline, the Star is going to run something, I need got something in the archives of LV interviewing so-and-so.
Yeah.
And we either had it or we didn't, but I could literally on a minute's notice walk over there and get it. With the warehouse, you'd have to go and get it, which is a round trip of an hour or so. But what I wasn't too keen on was the conditions. I don't know the conditions under which they're being kept. Ideally, archival material like that should be kept in a fairly
climate controlled.
Yeah, I mean, a warehouse to me is a bit cold, damp, potentially, not a place where I would personally store photographs. I would prefer them in an office environment where it's, the humidity is controlled.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hot or very cold. It's not damp. So I'm not saying I don't know what the warehouse is like, but it wouldn't have been my first choice of where to store photographs. Right? If they were my personal photographs, I wouldn't have sent them there.
You mentioned obviously the area that you worked in, prints and photographs. What do you remember in terms of reels and tapes and film? Where was that stored originally? Did you ever have access to that room? What did that room look like?
Well, the last time I saw it was in the basement. There were racks and racks of hundreds and hundreds of originally on film, reels of film, and then everything from 1-inch tape to 2-inch tape. I mean, the earlier tape decks were this is all before digital. 2-inch, literally 2-inch tape. Big reels of this stuff, and the originals were kept in what was called the library, right? And there were these. It was like in a sense, it was like a library. There were racks and racks of material coded, and you've seen some of these places where you can crank something and the wall would move, right?
Yeah.
You could store a lot more stuff. And when you wanted to get down an aisle, you just move it and it went sideways. It's pretty common in a lot of storage places. So that was, the last time I saw it was in the basement of TVO. I suppose it's still there. And and I don't know what happened afterwards, but they were digitizing a lot of it because some of the, I mean, nothing lasts forever, but stuff on film or videotape, eventually if it just, sits there, can deteriorate.
Oh yeah, was that something they were outsourcing, or did they have a machine that still played 1-inch and 2-inch tape?
Oh yeah, they had all of it. There were big, I don't know, size of your bookcase back there. I mean, there were big, bulky things, They had editing machines. I mean, um, in those 70s, a lot of the work was done on film, and there were film editors. They sitting down at an editing machine with the reels, looking, the little camera, literally cutting and pasting, cutting film with a razor blade.
And yeah, I've heard horror stories of that. For as much as you know, was the mandate to keep everything? Because I know some networks, there's, even if you hear stories about the BBC, if some of their old shows, they actually used to scrap things just because they needed the space, or they'd have to hand in reels and they would record over reels and stuff. Well, as far as you know, was the mandate to save everything?
I wouldn't go so far as calling it a mandate.
Okay.
I would say the assumption was to keep everything, because certainly from my point of view, there was see, in a way, we were recording from, let's say, 1970 to now, the current history of Ontario.
Oh yeah.
Right. So the people being interviewed, many, unfortunately, many people passed away. But for an archivist or a historian, some of that material would still have research value.
Well, and this is precisely why I'm having this interview with you too, for the very same reason.
Yeah. So
sorry, go on.
So, like, I've been away from there for a number of years. So I hope it was preserved, because it was just a rich source of material. The programmings themselves, but the people who appeared in those programs, all the people that were being interviewed, and there were shows. Polka Dot Door, for example. Many people who hosted those shows went on, were somewhat at the beginning of their careers, right, and went on to become celebrities.
Oh yeah. Well, one of the first hosts was Gordon Thompson, and he went on to be on Dynasty and a bunch of other shows. The sad thing that I discovered, because I've done some research, not a lot of research has been done on the history of Polka Dot Door, but in doing my research, TVOntario has been very gracious in providing me information in terms. Do you need to grab that?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
They've been gracious in providing me information in terms of what still actually exists, and sadly, well, in a good way, they've kept a lot of Polka Dot Door, but hardly anything from the year one. So the pilot doesn't exist anymore. Only 4 episodes out of the first 30 that were made exist. So there's only 4 of those episodes with Gordon Thompson in them that still actually physically exist.
Yeah, and I don't know why that is necessary. I don't think it was intentional. Sometimes people just don't realize the value.
Oh yeah, it could have been a spring cleaning thing, and it's just like, we need more space, and it could have been as simple as practicality of, we need more space on the shelf, and not having the foresight to see in 1984 the value of something in 2014, right?
Yeah, I agree with you completely there. Because when I left, I left. I was no longer an employee there, so I had no control over it. But I had some concerns over how all that material would be preserved, because I knew what was there, and someone else, let's say a manager, was coming in saying, "Well, what do we need?" I'm just making this up, but what do you need? All that stuff from 1974 episode of something. And they think, "Oh, just we need the space," as you were saying, and then once it's gone, it's gone.
The nice thing about digitizing is that you can have your history and you can have your preservation as well.
And you can compress it. There was a physical, after it started to take up space when you're actually cataloging physical assets, contact sheets, and prints and negatives and things, it starts to physically take up space, right? Digitizing it theoretically could go on a hard drive. You could.
Yeah, and I would be curious to know if they're actually throwing out the analog format when they're after they've digitized it.
Yeah, that I can't speak to. I don't
Now,
know.
while you were there, whose realm was that? Who was in charge of the video archive?
I can't think of a name. There was a department. There was a whole department. Oh, I should be able to remember the name, but I don't. I don't.
That is all. That is all good. Well, I wanna wrap up with just a couple of quick questions here. Thank you so much for the time that you've given already. Well, curious to know, um, what was one of the challenges that you faced in this position?
Um, the challenge, as I said earlier, the challenge was um, to get the people, the publicists, or who set me out on assignment, knew they needed photographs, but the challenge was always showing up. I mean, not unannounced. They knew I would be coming or go with them, but sandwiching myself in when you can't, when you're on a set, live, or on a set when they're filming. I can't. The ideal thing would be to take photographs as it's happening, but the sound of the camera might interfere. So I would have to either work during rehearsals, or or when a take was done, and then rush in and do photographs. Some of the challenges were during rehearsals. The actors weren't necessarily always in makeup and costume, so the photographs I were taking, in a sense, useless because they were in street clothing, right? So there was always pressure in terms of time, right, to get high quality photos. The best times would be when it was scheduled in, right? The producer or director says, "No, we're going to stop. We're going to take an hour, and we're going to do stills." And I would just get in there with equipment, and because there's in terms of lighting, for still photography and video, there were differences in
Right.
terms of quantity. So, I mean, I would often have to shoot what was available. I mean, it was lit for television, which was adequate for television, but not always ideal for still photography. Ideally, I should come in with a flash
Right.
equipment, umbrellas, a medium format camera if possible, rather than just 35 millimeter. Set it up on a tripod. Do tests. This was time consuming, but the quality of the images was far superior. I mean, now with digital photography, it doesn't matter. You can, a digital camera can adapt to whatever lighting conditions you are. You can have high megapixel camera. I mean, you don't need a big camera anymore.
Right.
You need a lot of megapixels. So it's a lot easier than it was. So the challenges were, especially on days when things weren't going well on the set,
Right.
because they were just behind schedule to get 5 minutes, 10 minutes with the actors, and as gracious as the actors are, it was an additional thing for them to do.
Sure.
They've just done 5 or 6 takes. They may be tired. They may want to go back and just relax and have a coffee and relax. So it was they had to be up again emotionally
Right.
for the stills, and
What did you? Sorry, go on.
oddly, not all actors like still photos. They're used to they used to assuming a role other than themselves. They're assuming a character, right? And they're talking and moving. When you stop and pose for a still photograph, the actor suddenly realizes, "Ooh, this is just me," you know, in front, on a still photograph. And sometimes they're not as oddly, they're just not as relaxed as they are when they're acting, because it's a different situation. They're now posing as themselves, right? Even if they're in costume and character. When they're actually acting and interacting with their actors, they're talking and they're moving around. So most actors were fine with that. Some needed a little more psychological relaxation.
Coaching.
Coaching.
What did you enjoy the most about your job at TVO?
Well, the variety, especially in the 80s. I mean, there was so much diversity, and we were doing drama. I mean, they were doing the equivalent of drama shows. So going out with those crews was more like being with a film crew, an actual production crew. Going out on production, going out of in a studio, everything's controlled. When you're going out to a farm or you're out on a set, it's a lot more challenging, but it's a lot more interesting. You don't always have control over the fact that an ambulance is going to go by, or you're doing a period piece from 1870, right, about pioneers in Ontario, and an ambulance goes by, or a plane goes overhead, or something, it was a bit more challenging, but it was one of the things. Oddly enough, occasionally, rarely, but occasionally, we would take the full costumed pokeroo out on location to either a mall or a school or someplace, and they would do some videotaping, and we'd be out, let's say in a mall, and the kids would always rush up, but there were teenagers and adults who had grown up with watching pokeroo, and they would come over. I mean, these are like 20-year-old people, 30-year-old people, say, "Oh my God, it's pokeroo," and they would start going into. I watched pokeroo when I was 7 years old, and it would bring back all these memories, and they would go up and touch pokeroo, and they knew. I mean, it made you realize, wow, this one show in particular had a real effect on these people. It wasn't just some bit of entertainment, you watch and forget about. People grew up with an affection towards the characters, not just Pokeroo, Marigold and Bear and Humpty Dumpty and stuff. To watch people 10, 20 years later, and they'd bring their kids, they'd say, "Oh, Sally, when I was your age, I watched Pokeroo, and here's Pokeroo," right? And they'd be just beaming and happy, and it made you realize, well, you were doing something, that mattered to someone, rather than just going, you're working and getting through the day and doing a thing, but it actually mattered to people. So it was nice. It was just a nice feeling to see people positively affected by it.
For sure. And generations, as you said, have been influenced by the shows that TVOntario has produced.
It's the same thing with L.W. Yost.
Yeah.
When L.W. went out on location, he for basically a small budget show. I mean, it wasn't you know a, he was a real celebrity, and if we went out on location, I mean, he was very recognizable. I mean, people would say, "Oh, it's Elwy Yost," and they would be like, "Can I have your autograph?" And I watched this, and I watched you, and I always watched Saturday Night at the Movies, and he was always very gracious, and he always seemed to be he was a very humble man. He thought, oh well, he was always a bit taken back by the fact that so many people recognized him, and happy about it too, because he loved movies. He was really dedicated to it. And he had an educational background, like many of the on-air hosts. So it was a pleasure to go out. We would go out on location and do a lot of stills with Elwy, in a movie theater, holding a box of popcorn or something.
Very good. Now, Garth, have you saved anything from your time at TVO? Were there any prints that you could not part with, or anything that hangs in your house that are from your time there?
I wish I had, but I didn't really. I mean, I have. No, I didn't really. I turned in everything. I mean, I saved copies of annual reports and stuff, that I liked, but as far as the stills, really, they're all still in those archives.
In the warehouse.
The warehouse, yeah.
The mysterious warehouse, hopefully being preserved so that other people can enjoy them down the road. Well, Garth, thank you so much for taking the time to chat a little bit about your career today, and a big thank you to you from all of us that grew up on TVO, enjoying your photography and your creative work.
It was my pleasure. I know it brought back a lot of memories too. It was great. It was great years working there. I mean, you move on when you retire, but it was tremendously creative, and working with so many talented people and dedicated people. When you're working in a commercial situation, you're working to ratings and you're working to sell, cars and Coca-Cola. But when you're working in an education, like PBS, or TVO, you're working with a purpose to, educate and enlighten people. And there's a whole different atmosphere, rather than when something's commercially driven just to get ratings.
Right.
And if the show's not doing well, everybody, you drop like 5% because the ratings are down. There were shows on TVO that had very few viewers, book shows, for example, that TVO stuck with for years because they were important, because it was the only place they were doing, literature or film, right? And everybody else, they wouldn't do a book show on a commercial station because you'd get 10,000 people viewing it, which was insignificant, right? Mm-hmm. But TVO stuck with their shows, and it was it mattered to a lot of people.
So, like their logo used to say all those years, television that matters, right?
Yeah, actually, that's funny. Yeah, that's right. That was the slogan, and it did matter. Not to them. You never got millions of people tuning in. It was a specialty channel, but the people who did, and when you tell people, well, what do you do for a living? Say, I work at TVO. Right away, yeah, I'm a big fan of TVO. I watch this, I watch that, and my kids watch this and that, and it was like, there was a connection. They really had a loyalty to it. So it was great years.
It's great. Well, thanks again, Garth. I know after I hit stop here, we'll have a couple of minutes to chat. But thank you so much for doing this interview, and thank you for your contributions. And really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. It was fun. Thank you.